When the AEF first showed up in France, the Allied leaders desperately wanted Pershing to just throw what units he had available right into the line, to mix them in with the units that were already serving in the trenches that stretched from the English Channel down to the Swiss border. Pershing would not allow the AEF to be broken up in such a fashion. One concession he made to them was by sending the African American troops for use in the front lines.
The Germans would ultimately nickname these African American soldiers fighting as a part of the AEF Hellfighters. And when you consider that the regiment drilled at its National Guard armory in Harlem in New York City, it's understandable that they would reach for and they would proudly accept this nickname, the Harlem Hellfighters. The Harlem Hellfighters speak to the racial situation in the United States at the time of the Great War. But they also speak to something very interesting, and that is a very large number of the men who would ultimately serve in the 369th Infantry Regiment. They recognized that the First World War afforded them an opportunity to demonstrate patriotism.
They went overseas, accompanied by their famous band, led by James Reese Europe, who is credited with bringing jazz to Europe. And once they got to France, again, units refused to serve with them. And this was not only in the U.S. Army, but even with the British Army. However, the French Army had no such compunctions. They already had Senegalese troops, Moroccan troops, Algerian troops who had fought with great bravery all throughout the war. And so the 369th was assigned to a French army.
Although they were the victims of segregationist policies, and although they were the victims of discrimination over and over again, and although they were treated as second-class citizens, they looked at the opportunity of national service during the Great War as a chance to prove themselves. And this they would do in hard-fought combat on the Western Front.
One of the men that served with the 369th Infantry was William Henry Johnson. And on May 15, 1918, he found himself on guard duty at Outpost 20 near the Argonne Forest with another man, Needham Roberts. They were the subject of a massive German trench raid. William Henry Johnson fought him with grenades, with his rifle butt, with his fists, and with a bolo knife. It's said that he even put his knife through the head of one of the Germans. By the time it was all over, Needham Roberts was not captured by those Germans. William Henry Johnson had received 21 wounds, and there were 24 dead Germans there. After that heroic action, the French awarded William Henry Johnson the Croix de Guerre with Star and Bronze Palm. It wasn't until 2002 that the United States Army bestowed on him the Distinguished Service Cross. And in 2015, posthumously obviously because William Henry Johnson died in 1929, he was finally awarded the Medal of Honor. The African Americans that served in France as infantry didn't serve with American units beyond their regimental formation. They served under French command in French divisions. Sometimes they were together, sometimes they were apart. But one thing they had in common was the use of the French Adrienne helmet, French equipment, and of course, French rifles like the Berthier and the Lebel.
The standard French rifle, of course, that period was the Model 1886 Lebel, which had really ushered in the whole era of smokeless powder.
The 1886 Lebel had some oddities to it. It used a rim cartridge, but a tubular magazine under the barrel. So with a pointed bullet, they actually had to put an annular ring around the primer for that bullet in the tubular magazine to not set off the primer.
It was very similar to the magazine style of a Winchester lever action, but instead of a lever, it uses a bolt similar to the Mauser designs that began in 1867. The Lebel was a long-barreled infantry rifle, and it served from 1886 throughout the First World War, and variants of it continued to be used all the way up until the Second World War.
The main gun issued to African American troops in World War I was the 1907 15 Berthier, and it's a full-length military rifle, and it took a 3-shot in-block clip. The Berthier rifle really started off in the French Army as a carbine in 1890. The Lebel was the standard infantry rifle. Artillery and cavalry would use the 1890 Berthier. And the Berthier had the bolt, essentially, of the Lebel rifle. It's not exactly a gun that's ideal for trench warfare, but regardless, it was used by Americans.
We are right now near a town called Le Harazi, which is not too far from Binarville. This place is originally a French engineering camp that was built up because they had the time and the people and needed to store materials and supplies, including armament. It's a very difficult country once you get past here. It's a steep escarpment and then lots of trails and places that were ancient rivers. So it gets very steep, very difficult to attack. You're attacking down, you're attacking up, and the Germans had several lines of trenches as you go further and further uphill in that direction. So we are here in a part of the Meuse-Argonne offensive, and the areas that you can see behind me were actually used by, at one point, elements of the 93rd Division, and photographs exist that show them resting here, making coffee, and getting ready to make the final push.
Well, much of the AEF that was fighting during the summer of 1918 were doing their fighting with French shows as their squad automatic weapon. This certainly was true of the 369th Regiment, the Harlem Hellfighters.
The French shot was and has been much maligned, being a piece of junk, not working very well. The soldier would jam, the soldiers would throw it away, blah, blah, blah. In point of fact, it was a milestone in infantry armament. For the first time, a light machine gun that was easily portable could be brought forward with the troops on the advance.
The 369th Infantry Regiment fight in some of the most well-known actions of the First World War. It will spend more time on the line than any other infantry regiment, and it will ultimately sustain more casualties. Indeed, the 369th, by the end of the war, by the armistice of 1918, has suffered 1,500 battlefield casualties, more than any other regiment serving in the American Expeditionary Force.
It was interesting to note that most black veterans returning from 1918, a lot of them wanted to stay in France because the racism that was prevalent throughout the United States at that period of time, or just the social condition of the two classes, wasn't that way at all in France.
The one part of the U.S. government that was absolutely colorblind, that treated these men with dignity and respect, was in how they were treated once they perished in the service of our country. In the cemeteries today, maintained by the American Battle Monument Commission, they're not black, they're not white. They're American soldiers who gave their lives in the service of their nation. And that's really where the first equal treatment of black soldiers in the U.S. military occurred.
This marble cross marks the final resting place of Corporal Freddie Stowers. He served with the 371st Regiment of Infantry and was a lowly corporal. But when his officer and his sergeant were wounded or killed in action, he led his men across an open field against a wooded knoll. In front of that, by several hundred meters, was a German trench. The Germans put up a white flag. Thinking he'd captured a bunch of Germans, he and his men rose to take the position and take the prisoners when the Germans opened fire. Stower was mortally wounded, but he continued to urge his men forward, and they did drive the Germans off, but in the end, at the cost of Stower's life and others from his company. In 1991, the U.S. government opened the cases of a number of black men who might have been considered for the highest military honor available, the Medal of Honor, and Stowers was granted that great privilege in 1991.